lot more than I'll expect you to be able to take in real time. But as with other things during the course, we'll be returning to these inevitably again and again, particularly when it comes to teaching, because pronunciation is a big part of presenting new language. So we'll look at the bits, and we'll look at the bigger stretches, and we'll try to work out how we can establish boundaries between sounds, which is a bit technical. I apologise in advance. There are a bit of technical things involved today, but it is important for us as language teachers to understand how sounds, how individual sounds are produced and what factors are involved in that. Particularly, as we'll see as we go along and we'll look at some examples, particularly when it comes to thinking about how we teach learners new sounds, or how we deal with sounds that are confusing for them because of their first language, and so on and so forth. And then, these will be the kind of bits, and then later on we'll look at how sounds combine with one another, how they affect one another in broader stretches of language. So let's start then with these individual sounds. A couple of things just to ask ourselves. When we're thinking about sound by sound in a language, we need to think about sounds that we ourselves have in our mother tongue, in English, because obviously our learners are trying to learn those sounds. So we need to ask ourselves at the outset, what are sounds? What is it that makes a sound recognizable to a speaker of the language with that sound in it? And then we need to think about it from the teaching point of view. So pedagogically, a good first question to ask yourself when you're going to be teaching a new group, whether it's multilingual or monolingual, is what kind of sounds are likely to give my learners a challenge, and therefore give me a challenge. And that often is, but not always, but often is down to whether the sound in question is common between the two languages, in which case it's unlikely to create any problems, or whether the sound is alien one way or another. In other words, it exists in English but not in the learner's first language, or whether it exists in the learner's first language and is slightly different from the sound we want them to achieve in English, if that makes sense. Okay, so where does the crossover come between what learners will be able to say and what will almost inevitably create a teaching challenge? So let's think about how linguists deal with this. There are two ways of dividing sounds up in a language. One of them essentially is a kind of simplified way of doing so, and one is a more accurate way of doing so. It might come as a surprise, but we're interested in the simplified way of classifying sounds. And when we do that, we talk about these things, phonemes. The phonemes of a language are those sounds which a native speaker will declare as being what's linguistically known as significant. In other words, it's a sound that has meaningful potential in a language. It's a sound that a native speaker would recognize. But in fact, phonemes don't really exist. As I say, they're a simplification, and it'll become obvious in a second when I hopefully when I try and demonstrate the difference between these idealized sounds and real sounds. The real sounds that any speaker makes in whatever language are known as allophones, and these allophones are in fact subdivisions of phonemes. So they are part of a idealized sound, but they are what we say because of where they are in a word. Sounds are affected, as we'll see, by what comes before them and what comes after them, if